Now on BBC4, Peter Hitchens makes the case for Britain's amicable departure from the EU in this Sceptic aisle.
200 years ago, at Trafalgar, in one of the most ferocious sea battles in world history, British independence was saved for more than a century, mainly by actions commanded from this ship.
And now our national independence is under threat once again, this time not from cannon fire and musket shots, but from the slow tide of regulations, edicts, decrees and treaties from the European Union in Brussels.
Our independence from the continent had meant a unique form of liberty under the law, prosperity, global power and trade, and a flourishing, distinct culture. Our trusted institutions, from our free parliament to our unarmed police force, grew out of this precarious independence. But now, as rule from Brussels eats away at all these things, an instinctive skepticism has taken root among many of us. In this journey, I'll explain how for the past 3 decades we've been signing away our independence. I feel it's a sad story of dishonesty and evasion. In the early 70s, Britain was a different, more insular place. Dazed after the rapid loss of empire, we felt lost and adrift. For some, it may have been a time of innovation and excitement, though for me, its fashions and design look strange and eccentric today. I remember this era as bleak, scruffy, apprehensive, and grey. Many could only dream of buying a new cooker, a black and white TV set, or a holiday abroad. An unloved Tory government ran a discontented country with a small Commons majority. Edward Heath was Prime Minister.
Our purpose is not to divide, but to unite.
The early 70s were years of strikes, crises, petrol shortages and rising inflation. But Heath's most treasured aim was to join what was then called the Common Market. He claimed it would end our economic woes.
If you stay, you won't be sorry, 'cause we believe in you.
But he also believed that our political future lay on the continent, within a united federal Europe.
Hung up on romancing.
The Elysee Palace, scene of the vital talks on the common market between the French President, Monsieur Pompidou, and our Prime Minister. The talks are regarded as the final make-or-break attempt to get Britain into the European Economic Community.
Heath applied to join in 1970. He had led the Macmillan government's failed attempt to join the community in the early 60s. Now, though on considerably worse terms, he would succeed.
These are the beliefs which I am now convinced after these talks will carry us through to the conclusion of this great enterprise.
Merci, mesdames et messieurs.
The feeling amongst an enormous number of people that this friendly arrangement, this trading arrangement, allowing us to freely move goods, money, people across frontiers, was a great thing. That there were lots of problems that we could solve together. Environmental problems, problems of decaying industries.
On the fringes, there were significant doubters from both right and left, but they were dismissed as extremists by the establishment of the time, even though their arguments turned out to be sound.
You've done it all. You've broken every code.
The leading Tory sceptic was Enoch Powell, a pale, intense intellectual. He was already in political exile, sacked from the shadow cabinet in 1968 by Heath for his infamous inflammatory speech about immigration.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your intelligent reception.
For many, his message on Europe was drowned out by his stance on immigration. Back then, the Sceptics, known as anti-marketeers, were a small and isolated band.
What turned me from an ardent pro-marketeer into an increasingly sceptical one? Enoch Powell. I was quite close to him.
Thank you.
The basic argument was that sovereignty really lay in national parliament, and that it would be very unwise to transfer the authority of government.
I do not believe that this nation, which has maintained and defended its independence for 1,000 years, will now submit to see it merged or lost. Nor did I become a member of our sovereign parliament in order to consent to that sovereignty being abated or transferred.
Powell's brilliance and eccentricity were matched on the left by Labour's equally wayward Anthony Wedgwood Benn, as he then was.
Is there a car I can sit on the top of? Has anybody got a car? There's a Land Rover.
Benn, an ambitious radical, led Labour's anti-marketeers. He saw, earlier than most, the threat Brussels posed to the power of Parliament.
I issued a letter to my constituents in which I set out the constitutional changes that in future, whoever you vote for, you won't be able to change the laws that have been made, that Parliament can be overridden, and that actually you lose control of your own society and your own economy. It has always, in my mind, been a democratic argument.
Government, Whitehall and the whole of Fleet Street are still trying to brainwash the British people, of all people, into believing that we are quite unfitted to exercise the same basic right of self-determination.
Benn and Powell were by no means entirely alone. On the streets, opposition came from those most directly affected, British farmers. They feared, with good reason, the Common Agricultural Policy. But Ted Heath insisted that a golden future beckoned for all.
Those who are concerned with industry have become more and more strongly in support. They believe that Europe is going to give us the market on which we can sell our goods and they can expand. And then once again, that means jobs.
Help the British homegrower! Help! Help! Help the British homegrower!
Ignoring opposition from farmers, fishermen, the trade unions, much of the Labour Party and an uncertain public, Heath marched on, bringing the legislation to join the EEC before Parliament.
Now that the TUC and the Labour Party, for whatever reasons, have voted overwhelmingly against entry, can you really claim that you have the full-hearted consent of the British people for entry? Because although they're not the government, they're a very important part of the people.
Yes, if Parliament gives us a majority, yes. But you say for whatever reasons. I think one might also be entitled just to form a judgment about the reasons.
The debates went on well into the night. Outside, demonstrators tried and failed to sound the alarm about what was going on. Most Conservatives loyally obeyed their leaders, as Tories had traditionally done. A tiny few rebelled.
There were only about a dozen of us who were real hardliners who opposed the bill. A great many went along, not out of great excitement or enthusiasm, but they felt it was the government were determined to have the legislation.
In the decisive vote, Labour were divided. Heath was confident, having maintained secret contacts with Labour's pro-marketeers. The Tory rebels' puny efforts were wiped out by a mass Labour defection of 69 MPs, led by Roy Jenkins. He faced such rage from Labour anti-marketeers that his friends advised him to leave the building as quickly as possible.
Whatever the strength of their pro-European community feelings, which I could respect, I couldn't understand why they had so substantially let the Heath government off the hook.
The legislation passed. Britain had ceased to be an independent country. Nobody knew then that the battle was far from over. Tony Benn felt his cause had been steamrollered by a ruthless political machine.
You argue your case, and then there's a vote in the House of Commons, and I felt it was a betrayal of the rights of the people I represented in Parliament. That's what I felt.
On the 22nd of January 1972, Heath went to Brussels to sign the treaty, whose real significance he had kept from the British people.
We have all come to recognize our common European heritage, our mutual interests, and our European destiny. Is to all who have laboured...
I thought that it was possible that we could create a powerful, united European state that would be democratic and effective. Ted Heath was trying to move Britain into a more entrepreneurial society.
A beginning of another stage in the construction of a new and a greater united Europe.
Many took Heath's predictions at face value. But now it is possible to see evidence that Heath concealed the market's ultimate destination from the public. Back then, Europe's leaders were already making plans to merge all the economies and currencies of the common market countries. Here, from the 9th of November 1970, is a document prepared by two Treasury officials on the revolutionary implications of economic and monetary union. It should be noted at the outset that the plan for economic and monetary union has revolutionary long-term implications, both economic and political. It could imply the ultimate creation of a European federal state with a single currency. All the basic instruments of national economic management would ultimately be handed over to the central federal authorities. The document actually makes it clear that Britain under economic and monetary union could end up being less independent than any of the 50 states of the USA. That's something that nobody has admitted in public ever since, but it sits here in the National Archive waiting for anybody who cares to read it to discover. The public were called on to celebrate, but they had no idea what they were supposed to be rejoicing about.
A few weeks ago, the government wrote to every parish council in the land, suggesting they do something, however modest, to mark British entry into Europe. Ivy Bridge, almost alone, rose defiantly to the challenge on a budget of £50 voted by the parish council.
In the common market, now we've joined the eating, you will see fantastic changes in our community as you walk along the Fore Street, as you go up Langham Way.
Not everyone was so impressed. Heath was so anxious to join at all costs that he accepted the common fisheries policy, which opened our fishing grounds to other market members. It would effectively destroy our fishing industry. In Ivy Bridge, even amidst the celebrations, there were sceptics.
I'll be quite honest. Honestly, I don't think we have anything to celebrate over. That's my opinion.
Isn't it a fact that the great debate that we were supposed to have a year ago was really a big sham?
Yes.
And a great debate wasn't held in public and people weren't informed.
Is there any one thing that you're actually looking forward to of joining the community?
I can't see any myself.
For many, the early impact of market membership was obscured by other events. Inflation, strikes, and the energy crisis caused by the 1973 Arab-Israeli War.
We are limiting the use of electricity by almost all factories, shops and offices to 3 days a week.
Heath thought the 1974 miners' strike was a chance to link Labour with the chaos. It might allow him to win a snap election. He asked, "Who governs Britain?" which took some nerve given that he had just transferred much governing authority to Brussels. But his opponent, Harold Wilson, pledged a referendum on Europe, mainly to cover up splits in his own party.
I do believe the British people, in view of all that's happened, must have the last final word through the ballot box in a referendum.
Enoch Powell, placing country above party, responded by urging his supporters to vote Labour.
So the elector, let us admit, Judas was paid. Judas was paid. I am making a sacrifice.
Powell's shocking intervention helped to tip the balance. Labour won a narrow election victory. Britain's first ever referendum would be held, and the people would at last have their say.
We've got a job to do. We can only do that job as one people, and I'm going right in to start that job now.
From the start of the referendum campaign, it wasn't a fair fight. Though the polls showed a majority for quitting, millions were open to persuasion.
I'd like to know a bit more before I voted. What sort of things do you want to know? Well, what it stands for and everything.
Nobody's been told properly in the papers or on the news exactly what is going on.
Nobody knows enough about the common market to vote.
Thank you very much.
Mrs Thatcher, surprise choice to succeed Heath as Tory opposition leader, was a prominent and committed voice in the cross-party Yes campaign.
Mrs Thatcher was passionately in favour. I wrote to her during the referendum and said, if people vote no, will you accept it? Certainly not, she said.
We want a jumper parade. Come on, we want a jumper parade. You keep telling me yes. They're tall, the girls. They're all tall. Please, I'm trying to work. Would you mind going away? Just stop it, will you please? Thank you.
Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country by getting Britain out of the common market.
The No campaign suffered badly from its lack of any serious establishment support.
We've been in the common market now for 2.5 years, and what have we seen? We've seen nothing. Rising prices, nothing at rising unemployment. Waste of money.
The argument wasn't going to be about membership of the common market. I think that the argument was going to be about these crazy people. Do you really want them to be running the show?
No to the common market and no to Powell as well. Read a socialist newspaper, read the Red Weekly.
And the Sceptics were stuck with the unwanted support of the ultra-right and the far left.
You find our capacity to sell our goods abroad threatened by more powerful continental manufacturers who have been able to get investment in their plant denied to British workers in this country.
We had no money. We had to fork up cash to pay for the hotel where we had a press conference. The other side had masses and masses of money.
Britain and Europe, good afternoon.
The pro-camp were backed by the European Commission and by millionaire businessmen. Their slick media campaign was planned over secret breakfasts at one of London's most opulent hotels.
Whatever their differences, on this issue, these politicians are united as never before.
If we came out of the community, the effect on investment here would be damaging.
We'll get the benefit. The areas of high unemployment, the development areas, the whole of Scotland will benefit.
We know there'll be fewer jobs if we come out.
The unequal contest ended with an unequal result. Hopelessly ill-prepared, outspent, outmanoeuvred and divided, the No campaign flopped, and the country voted heavily for yes. In fact, for all the good it did them, the No campaign might as well have stayed at home. In the hot summer of 1975, the campaign was soon forgotten.
In the summertime, when the weather is high, you can stretch right up and touch the sky. When the weather's fine, you got women on your mind. Have a drink, have a drive, go out and see what you can find.
Other issues now dominated British politics. Economic decline seemed unstoppable. Strikes, uncontrollable. The left continued its slow-motion takeover of the Labour Party. Jim Callaghan succeeded Harold Wilson at the head of a demoralised minority government. Europe seemed a closed issue.
Tell you what I don't want to see.
What's that?
Labour in power again.
Labour in power? Was that the Marx Brothers?
No, another bunch of comedians.
Coming shortly, the Conservatives.
By 1979, with Britain knee-deep in rubbish, and so strike-bound that even bodies were not being buried, the pro-market Margaret Thatcher took office.
I can't bear Britain in decline. I just can't. We who either defeated or rescued half Europe, who kept half Europe free, when otherwise it would be in chains. And look at us now.
For the Thatcher government in May 1979, Europe was still a minor side issue. She wanted to break the power of the unions and liberalise the economy. Blithely unaware of what lay in store, the Conservatives were overwhelmingly pro-European.
God bless you. I'm foreigner, but I came to see you and congratulate you. I'm delighted. Good luck.
The Sceptics were an irrelevance.
Mrs. Thatcher was enthusiastic about the question of Europe. I'd already become a little bit sceptical myself because I'd had contact with people who were working in the European environment, and they had this sort of tiresome tendency to be idealistic and grandiose and theoretical, and all of this I found very otherworldly and impractical.
But while the Tories drifted complacently, the issue was still very much alive in the Labour Party. The party's hard and sceptical left used the 1979 defeat to seize power. They turned against what they saw as a capitalist plot. The lovable but ineffectual Michael Foot became leader. Tony Benn appointed himself the workers' champion. By 1983, Labour were wholly committed to withdrawal from the European community. The manifesto stated clearly, British withdrawal from the community is the right policy for Britain, to be completed well within the lifetime of the Parliament. Thanks to Foot's far-out policies and Mrs. Thatcher's Falklands triumph, Labour were annihilated in the 1983 election. Neil Kinnock inherited the seemingly hopeless task of leadership. By 1984, the combative Margaret Thatcher faced her first real fight in Europe. At Fontainebleau, Mrs. Thatcher fought a rebate battle against the French and the Germans. Britain's huge net contributions to the community were plainly unfair. But this was not a fundamental clash of principle. Her aim was to make Britain's membership more bearable, not to undermine it. She succeeded in cutting our contribution by a third.
we've got 66% of a certain gap between what we put in and what we get out. It's not quite the whole amount, but it's 66%, and it will last much longer than any previous agreement.
Her most pro-European period came after the successful conclusion of the debate on our budget rebate, when she launched the initiative on this building the European single market. And if you read her memoirs, you'll find that even in 1985 she was describing herself as a European idealist, perhaps with a different ideal of exactly how Europe should develop from many others, but still as a European idealist.
Mrs. Thatcher wanted to complete the so-called single market. Supposedly, this meant British goods could be sold easily in European community countries on equal terms. Ministers thought it would boost our newly deregulated economy. But in return, we had to hand over important decision-making powers to Brussels and lose many of our national vetoes. In Brussels, running the Commission was Jacques Delors, the man Mrs. Thatcher thought could help with the creation of the single market. She didn't grasp that Delors was a keen federalist who had advanced plans for the United States of Europe, together with monetary and economic union, or that the Single European Act she signed would bring the European superstate far closer.
There was a tendency, particularly in the Foreign Office, but I think among the British politicians too, to underestimate the strength of the drive to ever greater integration, and to underestimate too the importance of each small step leading to something else.
At the Luxembourg summit in 1995, Mrs. Thatcher agreed to the act, handing substantial power to Brussels.
There are some people who are going to say, oh, this majority voting means that we could be voted down on important subjects.
Yes, but on the other hand, we do need to get some of our trade and business into the common market, which is stopped now because they won't agree to certain standards because one person can veto it.
I was Margaret Thatcher's chief policy advisor in the middle 1980s. The only thing I was not responsible for was Foreign Office policy, and the single market was on the edges. It was at the territorial dispute end of the spectrum. Foreign Office advises very strongly to back it. I was very worried about it.
Margaret Thatcher went into the Single European Act wholeheartedly and enthusiastically. She thought that was to the benefit of Britain because we would be able to export more. She thought it was to the benefit of Europe because it would open it up and liberalise the economy.
Look at the title of that treaty, Single European Act. Nothing much about a market there. It's about a single Europe. It's not about a single market. It was about giving a whole new vast tranche of powers. I mean, it's in that treaty that we get for the first time mentions of the single currency, economic and monetary union, and of a common foreign policy and a common defence policy. Everything that's been rolling on ever since actually began at that time.
Now, in 12 areas of decision-making, we could be outvoted and overruled by the rest of Europe. As a deregulated city boomed, small business was swamped by a mudslide of new Brussels rules.
It was an enormous new burden for people running almost any kind of industry, scrap metal, fishermen, care homes, whatever. People who were affected directly and found that their business was becoming much harder to run, or in some cases impossible. I mean, we lost tens of thousands of businesses because they couldn't comply with all these mad regulations that were pouring out.
The Single European Act was a major step towards political and economic union, missold as an opening up of markets. The sceptics had failed to pay enough attention to it, and so it slipped easily and quickly through Parliament. Mrs. Thatcher went on to win a third election in 1987. She and her government were tired and stale, but weak opposition kept her in office. Her cabinet were restive, and many colleagues yearned to displace her, and she was starting to have serious doubts about Europe, doubts she confided to close allies.
In '87, there was still a prospect that the Single European Act might benefit the United Kingdom. but it became gradually clear that it was not doing so. And I think then that caused me, and I suspect Margaret Thatcher too, ask ourselves some of the questions which Enoch Powell had raised much earlier. And I remember now so clearly Enoch observing that the European Union could never be a democratic system.
Mrs. Thatcher's alarm grew when Jacques Delors made a provocative visit to the Trades Union Congress, fraternising with her sworn enemies. She and Labour realised from this moment that Europe was a way of undoing Thatcherism by the back door. That discovery turned her into a Eurosceptic and swung Labour towards Euro enthusiasm.
The Labour Party were receiving the message from Europe. You can have back all the trades union rights which Norman Tebbit robbed you of in his legislation. Human rights legislation, social chapter from Europe, and it doesn't matter if you lose the election, the Tories will never be able to put it back. So they flipped.
My antagonism towards membership of the community had been one of the biggest areas of my life, and a different course had to be argued for. Happily, I was far from alone in the Labour Party.
It is necessary to work together. Dear friends, your movement has a major role to play. Europe needs you. Thank you.
Inspired by Delors, Labour rapidly transformed itself into a fervently pro-European party, which it has been ever since. Hearing the Delors speech, Mrs. Thatcher abandoned a holiday in Cornwall and crafted her response. Now, the sceptics, outsiders for so long, at last had an ally in the centre of British politics. Her speech in the ancient Belgian city of Bruges would be a decisive moment.
Mr. Chairman, you have invited me to speak on the subject of Britain and Europe. If you believe some of the things said and written about my views on Europe, it must seem rather like inviting Genghis Khan to speak on the virtues of peaceful coexistence.
The Bruges speech was almost like Martin Luther nailing his theses to the door of the church. Thus far and no further. She had decided the moment had come to try to set a different course in Europe. Now, you can argue perhaps she was too late. Maybe the tide had come in too far and she was struggling against it.
We have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level, with a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels.
It becomes clear that Margaret Thatcher, although she's Prime Minister, although she's leader of the Conservative Party, is also going to be the leader of the Eurosceptic faction. And of course, her standing was very, very high. And where she led, people followed.
I think that she could have united the Conservative Party round a broadly Eurosceptic position, not Europhobic at all, but Eurosceptic position, had she played it rather differently. In fact, the party became very divided.
The divisions were sharper because she had thwarted the ambitions of so many senior colleagues. She was isolated and exhausted. But her scepticism spurred others on. Anti-Brussels groups emerged around her. One was pointedly named after the Bruges speech.
Maggie went to Bruges, made her famous Bruges speech, and thereafter a group of us set up the Bruges Group. I became its kind of leading spokesman and pamphleteer. We all got together at the Reform Club. It was set up as a non-party group, although it was very largely Conservatives. It was converting the Tory party from being the major Europhile party into being the major Eurosceptic one.
One reason for the Tory Euro revolution was that the Thatcher economic miracle was running into trouble. After the boom of the 80s came the bust. of the early 90s. But worse would be the exchange rate mechanism, a first step towards merging the currencies of Europe.
We have applied this weekend to join the exchange rate mechanism.
It remains one of the great paradoxes of modern British history that Margaret Thatcher, of all people, should have been Prime Minister when Britain took the fateful step of joining the ERM.
We are in a position to apply for the exchange rate mechanism, which at the same time will underpin our anti-inflationary stance.
John Major and Geoffrey Howe got together and really twisted Margaret Thatcher's arm to make her enter the exchange rate mechanism. And that left the party rather bewildered. They could not understand how the Prime Minister, who had opposed it so vehemently, suddenly found herself in the exchange rate mechanism. And by the way, what a howling disaster it was.
An utter disaster. She now faced an inexorable timetable which would take Britain further towards absorption in a united Europe.
Now, with regard to some of
The closer she was to her doom, the more sceptical she became.
The President of the Commission, Mr. Delors, said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community, he wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no.
I believe that's probably about the time that the plots began. Plot number one was to force the Prime Minister into the exchange rate mechanism, whether she wanted it or whether she didn't. And plot number two, which evolved over a long period of time, was to get rid of the Prime Minister herself. And there's no doubt at all that Europe was fundamentally important to many of those members of the Cabinet who were responsible for getting rid of her in 1990.
Only weeks later, she was gone. The European issue destroyed Mrs. Thatcher, but her successor, John Major, proclaimed that he wished to be where we belong, at the very heart of Europe.
We knew that the people who were taking over, with Heseltine as Deputy Prime Minister and others in the government, that this was not a Eurosceptic government. Heseltine was a mad pro-European, and he later on gave an interview saying one day Britain would disappear from national memory.
Very quickly, John Major got what he desired, and a good deal more. Ever closer union was still on the agenda.
Major, BBC.
Despite friendly smiles, the other European leaders were already on the road to Maastricht. Major thought his opt-outs from the treaty were what mattered. Actually, it was the things he couldn't opt out of that counted more. Maastricht would undermine most of what Tory Britain held dear, yet Major rammed it ruthlessly through Parliament.
There is in this treaty a great deal that we have sought in this country for some years. The recognition of intergovernmental cooperation, subsidiarity, the reinforced rule of law which we sought, cooperation on justice and home affairs, improved foreign policy coordination, and stronger budget discipline.
Maastricht was the second of two great blows aimed at British national independence and sovereignty. But unlike the first, the Single European Act, Maastricht was quite openly a plan for accelerating political and economic union. In 1992, John Major was re-elected, just. But his hopes of an easy passage for the Maastricht Treaty were suddenly derailed. Having lashed his reputation to the ERM, he could not bring himself to quit it when danger threatened.
There are going to be no devaluations, no leaving the ERM. We are absolutely committed to the ERM. That is our policy.
The city quickly told a different story as the economic facts of life asserted themselves. Homebound commuters were bemused as they saw interest rates rise 3 whole points in one day.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day. Massive speculative flows have continued to disrupt the functioning of the exchange rate mechanism. that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
The Treasury's doomed, unhinged attempt to keep Britain in the ERM cost £3.3 billion, justly described at the time as the equivalent of chucking several modern hospitals into the sea. This not only destroyed forever the Tory party's reputation for economic competence, it put new fire into the bellies of all Eurosceptics. Here was evidence that Europe, long touted as our salvation, was dangerous to our economy as well as to our independence. Here was evidence that Europe, long touted as our salvation, was dangerous to our economy as well as to our independence.
As the weeks went by, new faces appeared, people I'd never thought of as being Eurosceptic, but they were all moving in that direction, and not least because they were wanting to put down a marker that they didn't really be happy about John Major's leadership.
Seeing Major in trouble, the Sceptics pounced at that autumn's Tory conference. Norman Tebbit turned on Major and ignited the rebellion against Maastricht, still not ratified.
Do you want to be citizens of a European Union? Let's launch the drive for Maastricht II, a treaty with no mention of more power for Brussels, no mention of economic and monetary and political union. It's a task in which I stand ready to join John Major whenever he is ready to begin.
I thought I might be able to save the government from itself. I used to style myself in those days the leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition, in the sense that this was a treaty which I saw as being fundamentally bad for Britain, and that within it there were a whole load of hooks on which new policies would be set in place.
As Major enjoyed the approval and friendship of other EU leaders abroad, he made enemies at home with his ruthless crushing of the Tory sceptics. 9 days after Maastricht passed, Major blurted out his true feelings about those who had opposed him.
You want to start this on a wide two-shot?
Yes, that's fine. Yeah, okay.
And where do you think most of this poison has come from? It's come from the dispossessed and the never-possessed. You and I can both think of ex-ministers who are going around causing all sorts of trouble. We want 3 more of the bastards out there.
There was an ambiguity because there were 4 Eurosceptics in the cabinet, and his remark was, I don't want another 3 of the bastards out there, in reply to why didn't he sack the Eurosceptics. So there was always debate between the 4 as to which of us had been left out and not been described as a bastard.
So I rang up number 10 and I said, I hear that the Prime Minister has called me a bastard. I assume this is false. Can I go and deny it? No, you can't. So I said, well, if it's not false, it would be very helpful to have a line to take, which is what it's called in the trade, which means this is what you have to say, because this is what the Cabinet believes. Can I have the line to take on whether I am or am not a bastard? The answer came back, there isn't one.
The unofficial line was that the sceptics were bastards, and nasty bastards at that. But obviously not nasty or effective enough. For in the end, they, and their Bruce Group allies, had failed to influence policy. So many of them concluded that the Tory party was not their friend, but their foe.
I became more and more convinced the Bruce Group itself was lacking the weight to pressurise the government into doing anything very radical, especially after the government's insistence that Maastricht be pressed through.
Sked set up the Anti-Federalist League and stood in the 92 election. A year later, while still lecturing at the London School of Economics, he started the UK Independence Party.
I had picked up a number of supporters. It looked as if there was every chance we could set up a new party. So there was a meeting at LSE one weekend. We decided to call it the UK Independence Party. The main reaction wasn't so much that the policy was ridiculous. The main reaction was that it's impossible for a new party to actually overturn the two-party monopoly, and that it was a wasted vote. I mean, that was what we came up against.
The divisions in Conservative ranks hadn't gone away because Maastricht was ratified or because some sceptics had defected. Far from it. There was now a civil war as bad as Labour's had been 20 years before. Disastrously for the Tories, this split became the dominant political story of the time, though it didn't shift policy.
The subject of Europe was so painful that on the whole the Cabinet didn't talk about it. Now, that may strike you as extremely surprising. But actually, during many of these painful months and years, the subject did not appear on the Cabinet agenda.
Why doesn't he stand aside and make way for somebody else who can provide the party and the country with direction and leadership?
Major is coming. Are you recording? Major's coming. I've lost all sound. Are you?
In a foredoomed effort to end the conflict, Major resigned and challenged his foes to stand against him.
I am not prepared to see the party I care for laid out on the rack like this for any longer. In short, it is time to put up or shut up.
John Redwood alone dared to do so. His bizarre campaign made the sceptic cause once again look eccentric and freakish.
I came into the House of Commons, I talked to a few friends and just said, what should I do now? And they said, well, you should run for the leadership. I said, well, have I got any support? And they said, yes, we'll support you.
Your decision to resign leaves our party in limbo when it needs firm but understanding leadership. It makes a contest inevitable.
The supposed Eurosceptic heavyweights decided this was not the right time.
And told him I would...
Redwood, himself a considerable intellect and a serious man, was left with a platform packed with Tory cranks and outsiders, and his bid failed. But the Tory government still had 2 miserable years of splits and squabbles ahead. Defeated inside the party, many sceptics now looked elsewhere for salvation.
And those of our members
James Goldsmith was a very exotic player in this particular drama. I think he tried to widen the sceptic case by making it to do with the referendum rather than what you thought should be the ambitions and the limits of European power.
Jimmy Goldsmith was a good thing insofar as the referendum party secured a promise from the Conservatives that on the euro there would be a referendum, and that was later endorsed by Tony Blair. He was a negative factor insofar as he gave the Eurosceptic movement the idea that the only way forward was to depend on multimillionaires and billionaires.
Even a multi-billionaire couldn't have saved the Tories in May 1997. Much of Labour's campaign had been phony, including this staged welcome, but the Tories had paid the price for fooling the country and themselves about what Europe meant. Edward Heath concealed the ultimate aim of the European project. Margaret Thatcher discovered far too late that it was impossible to be a patriotic Tory and a Europhile. Despite the opt-outs he had negotiated, John Major had ended up taking Britain far deeper into the European superstate than anyone had expected. And the civil war he launched against his opponents brought about the virtual ruin of the Tory party. Labour ought to have been the sceptics' nightmare. Anthony Blair claimed to be a keen Brussels enthusiast, and his party, once pledged to leave, were now pledged to go in as deeply as they could. But it wasn't quite so simple.
The high watermark for pro-European thinking within the Labour Party was actually the election day of 1997. New Labour was specifically a reaction to the policy positions held in '83. It therefore became axiomatic that a new modernised Labour Party had to be pro-European, compared to put distance between that and the old anti-European party circa 1983.
Its own sceptics powerless, Labour threw away Major's opt-out from the Maastricht Social Chapter Protocol. Its own sceptics powerless, Labour threw away Major's opt-out from the Maastricht Social Chapter Protocol. Many thought the decision to grant independence to the Bank of England was just the first step to Euro membership. And the Euro itself moved rapidly from plan to reality, driven through by France and Germany. By 2002, the new currency was a reality. Hi, I'd like to change 100 sterling into euros, please. The currency is not a symbol of national independence, like a flag or an anthem. It's a fact of independence, like a border or a legal system or an army. Whoever controls the currency controls the country, said John Maynard Keynes. And it's true, if you don't control your own interest rates or your own economic policy, you have no independence. Luckily for Britain, Blair lacked the nerve to hold his promised referendum, in case he lost. And a canny Gordon Brown devised a formula to postpone Euro membership for as long as it suited him to do so.
We've made the question of a single currency one of 5 practical economic tests that have got to be met. We will only recommend joining the single currency if these practical economic tests are met, and then that will be put to a referendum. And I believe that is the right way, that the issue of joining the single currency must be about hard-headed national economic interest for Britain.
I thought the 5 economic tests were thought up by Gordon to keep the issue about whether we joined the single currency within the Treasury and not in number 10.
Labour's rigid discipline demanded absolute loyalty, and so all but silenced the party's remaining Eurosceptics. But they do exist.
Britain in Europe, are you pro?
We are.
Oh, well, I'm against.
Well, you can read both sides of the argument.
Both sides, we get this crap all the time. It's the against we don't get.
Membership of the Euro creates constraints on the ability to what I would like a Labour government to do, which is to systematically redistribute power, wealth and opportunity to working class communities. And I think the whole fiscal framework that operates within the European Union, the constraints imposed by the operation of the central bank, mean that it acts as a constraint to do what a Labour government should be doing in terms of, for example, reinvesting in public services, the fight against crime, education, health, and redistributing resources into communities like mine in East London.
Blair made one half-hearted effort to please his European Union friends. In October 1999, he set up the cross-party Britain in Europe campaign to persuade public opinion of the alleged benefits of the single currency. Kennedy, Heath, Clark, Heseltine, the country's leading Brussels enthusiasts, sitting together with the Labour government.
Once in each generation, the case for Britain in Europe needs to be remade from first principles. And the time for this generation is now.
But he lost his nerve. Blair decided that the time to make the case for the euro to this generation would actually be some other time.
Given that the original aims of Britain and Europe, which were to promote a single currency, have been watered down, and it now becomes a support for Europe in general, and with you maintaining your position that you cannot yet decide one way or another over the single currency?
Our position actually is the same, that we support in principle the idea of Britain joining a successful single currency, provided that the economic conditions are met. But we are recognising that it's right to make the case again for Britain in Europe.
The sceptics, especially Business for Sterling, campaigned to real effect. Many influential figures, institutions and newspapers joined the cause with powerful and well-researched arguments. Decisively, many in the City of London turned against the idea.
3 years ago, it was said simply that Euro entry was an inevitability, a deterministic law of political economy of Britain or whatever. That's been proven to be untrue. I think the laws of economics actually act as a sort of handbrake on some of the more excessive dreams of some of my colleagues.
The Sceptics had shown their power by saving sterling, for now. They had also wounded the Tories. Tory defectors helped the UK Independence Party win 12 precious seats in the European Parliament. But with the Euro issue defused, Labour easily won a second term at Westminster, and the process of European integration went on, unopposed and often unobserved. European law begins here with one volume, a special edition for 1972. Then year by year, a whole shelf for each year, stretching out. The 80s, more 80s, into 1990, more and more of it. Each year, taking over from where English law used to rule and replacing it. These shelves, now reaching right up to now, with volume after volume for each month now, instead of just for each year, will eventually stretch around this whole library.
At the moment, Westminster's in denial. Looking at our parliamentary affairs, the record of what we do, you could hardly know we were a member of the European community. We never hardly discuss anything which actually governs the laws of this country. If we were serious, half the week would be spent scrutinising what's coming out of Europe.
But it's not.
It's not, but it should do.
Emboldened by years of uninterrupted moves towards final union, the EU's leaders at last came out into the open and proposed a European constitution, an unmistakable step towards a European state. Plans for an EU president, an EU defence force, and EU foreign policy, already quietly taking shape, suddenly sprang into sharp focus. Anthony Blair, imagining that the change could be sold as a tidying-up exercise, was one of the first to sign. Few realised it was a step too far. But it was. And this time it was the French and the Dutch who said no in twin referendums. These two founders of the project had at last discovered scepticism. Yet the project still marches on.
If you actually look at what's been going on, what's been the European Council's been up to, what the European Commission's been up to, it's as if that constitution never existed. They've carried on doing all sorts of things that are in that, like the integration of our defence forces, which is a hugely important thing that's going on at the moment. The European Defence Agency, which is at the heart of it, that is, quote, set up by the Constitution.
Opinion polls on this subject go up and down all the time. But it's my judgment that after 40 years of direct engagement with this European Union, there's now a deep, instinctive scepticism about the project among the British public, which has never been properly articulated by any major political party. In the past 3 decades, sceptical politicians from both right and left have stood in the way of the Brussels juggernaut in the hope of slowing it down, and have instead been squashed like so many hedgehogs. The EU is a machine with no reverse gear. A sceptical Britain will never accept its final goal. Why don't we acknowledge that the EU's aims and our way of life are simply incompatible? Why don't we just pull out of the European Union? None of this trade will stop if we do. We can carry on trading with everybody in Europe without losing any of our political independence. What would we really miss? All the alleged benefits of EU membership, from trade to residence, are available to non-members. Relations with the EU countries would instantly improve. Above all, independence is a precious thing. We rejoice as other nations regain theirs. Why should we give ours away?